using the Balanced Scorecard gauges and monthly grids. Both the objectives and initiative grids have the capacity to contain a numeric percent-based gauge. The image style used for these is set in the New Plan Wizard or Options module and can take the form of either a speedometer gauge or one of several other graphic symbols. The objective grid gauge value can be averaged from the initiative gauge values, and each initiative grid gauge value can be set as the average of any one of the monthly grid row values. Both gauges can be adjusted manually and locked if required. The organisational tree can also have speedometer gauge icons which show the average of all the employee objective gauges. Similarly, the average objective gauges can be represented inside the actual strategy map beside each objective. When these tree and map gauges are all driven from suitable rows lower down in the monthly grids, you have a concept called closed loop learning. This is where a strategic objective is created in the strategy map and is assigned to employees in the Balanced Scorecard. The objectives grid gauge is then driven by the average of the initiative grid gauges. The initiative grid gauge is driven by the averages of the appropriate monthly grid row. When changes are made to the monthly grid values, this will change the tree and map speedometer gauges. So if the tree or map gauges are not doing well, then there is a fault lower down in your operations. The concept of displaying the speedometer gauges inside the strategy map plus the ability to display the objectives grid with related gauge values is called Strategy Map WYSIWYG. WYSIWYG is a well-known computer acronym for what you see is what you get. Setting up gauges in the objectives and initiatives grid. These grid columns are set up in the New Plan Wizard when creating a new strategic plan, or the Options module if the plan already exists. This screen shows the Options module. You can set the column name and cell style. We call the objective grid gauge as gauge, whilst in the initiatives grid we call it rating. If you are using an icon such as a speedometer gauge, you can optionally have a grey numeric value hovering above and to the right of the icon. If you are adding this column to the grid, click on the checkbox to enable the column. Before doing this, it is a good idea to click on the column that will be to the left of the new gauge column. Otherwise, you can move the column to its final location using the arrow buttons. Setting up the monthly grids. If you want to have monthly grids, you must first have a date range column enabled in the initiatives grid. When this is done, you can set up the monthly grids in the Options module, and you'll need to decide what you want plus what you are going to call them. When this is done, you can define a number of months and have these represented as cells in a monthly grid for every initiative. If you are using a planned and actual or before and after concepts, it is important to understand that the planned cell data is entered ahead of the date, whilst the actual cell data is entered after the date has passed. To calculate a derived value such as actual divided by planned, the software needs to know if an actual month value is valid. For example, is this zero value really a zero, or just hasn't been entered yet? There are two styles of grid. They have both planned actual and actual divided by planned capability, with the actual cells hidden from the display if the date range month is not set as valid. The date range months are not restricted to any financial year, and each initiative can be different. Firstly, the Gantt grid is usually called the progress grid. It is a multi-function grid that allows plain text, numbers, or icon gauges, and each grid can be set up differently for each initiative row. Secondly, the numeric grid is usually called the finance grid. It has the two series which are usually called income and expense. Planned and actual values produce derived values such as actual divided by plan, whilst the two series provide derived values such as actual and planned profit. Editing the initiatives grid monthly data. The edit mode screen has the two grids, objectives and initiatives, and below that is the edit panel. When you click on a grid cell to edit, the appropriate values are shown in the edit panel. To edit the monthly grids, click on the icon in the Initiatives grid. There are 6 stages to setting up an Initiatives grid with monthly data. Firstly, you need to set the date range. This is a list-based column, so you can simply choose an existing one. If it does not exist, then add a new one or edit an existing one on the fly while staying in grid edit mode. The date range sets a number of months, and these become the cells in the monthly grid. When editing the date range, a valid month grid appears, and you can decide what actual data months are valid. Secondly, set the Gantt Grid style. Please note that if you set pure text mode in the Gantt Grid, then this cannot drive the gauge. You can enable the rows differently for each initiative and also have special row names. Thirdly, you need to enter in the Gantt Grid data. Click on the Edit Progress Grid icon in the Initiatives grid, and the monthly grid will display in the Edit panel area. If your grid contains the gauges, then the software will want to know the best and worst values, so that it can scale the gauge value. If lower numbers are better, for example, workdays lost, then click on the triangular angle bracket. Click on the grid cell and enter in the required values or text. Fourthly, you need to enter in the numeric data, first series and then second series. Again, the monthly grid values are displayed in the Edit panel. Click on a cell and enter in the numeric data required. Lastly, locate the Initiatives grid gauge cell and select the monthly grid row that will be the gauge driver. As you enter in the data or enable the months, the gauge should all respond. Summary. The Balanced Scorecard monthly grids allow you to do planned and actual budgeting, or compare before and after, and have these values drive the gauges back up in the organisational tree and inside the actual strategy map. Thank you for watching this video demonstration.